Hello everyone. Now we look at a very exciting game played between Hans Niemann and Anton Korobov in the Tata Steel Challengers 2024 edition. Hans Niemann had the white pieces and he started with c4, c6, knight f3 and d5 striking in the center, g3, we're just ignoring that pawn for now, knight f6 and bishop g2, d takes c4 and a4 preventing b5 and g6. Knight a3 and queen d5 here, defending the pawn for the time being. Castles and bishop g7. So both sides have fianchettoed their kingside bishops. And h4. Bishop f5 developing. And b3 here. Well, just challenging that pawn, and you could even capture it, and white cannot recapture immediately, would have to play something like bishop b2. And black would castle and then d3, threatening e4, and the bishop would have to go back, and you can play knight c4, threatening maybe knight e3. That's a possibility. Queen into b3 is a possibility. So let's say queen d7 and queen takes b3. Bishop takes knight and queen takes bishop, and let's say a5, gaining some space. And this would be a balanced position, although white is down a pawn but has the bishop pair. But after b3, c3 was played, and this is also fine. There are a couple of ways of replying here. You could play, let's say, knight to c4, threatening knight e3. There could be c2 here, pushing the queen to e1, and then let's say knight g4, opening the bishop's attack to the rook. This is fine, and then forcing rook a2. After knight c4, you can also capture on d2. And let's say bishop to a3. Now the e7 pawn will be hanging if black castles, and queen d7 defending, and we offer a queen trade by capturing on d2. Queen takes a knight ft2. This way white has control on the e4 square, and we can push e4, e5 in. Let's say a5, trying to gain some space and maybe prepare b5 eventually. e4, bishop e6 and e5, knight d5 and maybe f4. And the white center is quite solid, and this is also quite playable. But after c3, d3 was played, and this is not as strong as the previous variations. Well, first just the queen d8, getting out of that e4 fork, and knight c4 now. Bishop f4 was also possible, because this way we can reroute the bishop to e5 and then grab that c3 pawn, and we'll see that c3 pawn becomes an irritant later on. Knight bd7, for example, this is important to guard e5, and then queen c1, and black can castle, then we can go bishop h6. Bishop takes, queen takes, and e5 now. There is a threat of playing knight g4 just to push the queen back to c1, so we can bring the queen back to c1 anyway. Queen a5 can defend the pawn for the time being. This is also playable. Black is slightly better here, but this was also playable. Knight c4 here perhaps is not the most accurate of moves, because it allows, you can have knight a6 afterwards. And let's say queen e1 going after the pawn, you can play knight g4 now, and the bishop on g7 defends the pawn. So black has delayed castling in this line, and if d4 then c5. This was the point of knight a6, that we can play c5 and then the knight can be activated on the c5 square. Let's say e4, pushing that bishop back, bishop goes back to c8, and then d5. But this also means that the c3 pawn is secured. Knight b4, this is possible. Another advantage of knight a6. And let's say bishop, you can play queen e2 here, preventing any knight forks, but the castles, bishop f4 and e6, challenging white center. If d6, then e5, bishop e3 and b6. Black is better here, certainly. There is the c3 pawn is weak, but the d6 pawn also is not very secure. There could be bishop a6 coming next, and then maybe grab on c4 and eventually pick up the d6 pawn. This is one of the possible lines. However, after knight c4, Korobov castled, so he didn't go in that route, and Over here, queen c2 was possible. If knight g4 defending the pawn, then e4 and bishop d7 and a5, preventing a5 or b5 by black and preventing that expansion. But black is slightly better here, but not too much. But bishop a3 was played here, not going queen c2, not going after that pawn, but a5 now. Knight to e3 and knight d5. Interesting decision to mess up the kingside pawn structure, but it's okay in this position. That after knight into f5 and g into f5, black is still fine. That c3 pawn is quite well defended. d4, at least blocking the bishop's defense. But knight a6 now. Knight could land on b4. b5 was an option here. If a takes, then c takes, and of course we're threatening b4. That's a knight e5, and then b4 and bishop c1 and e6. Black is very solid, and that c3 pawn is very menacing now. So perhaps in this case, white would really regret not going after it sooner. This was a way to play, but knight a6 anyway. Queen d3. And e6 was an interesting idea, giving up the exchange. One point is that the dark square bishop for black will be unopposed after you give up a rook. Black could simply play queen c8 here. This is a reasonable way to play that, and you will push some pawns later on. Let's say knight e1, rook d8. You vacated that square later on in the previous move. Knight c2, knight a b4, bishop takes and a takes, and you have a very solid game here. But Korobov is a very interesting player, and he chose to give material. Niemann accepted, and queen takes f8. Now the queen could swing over to the queen side. That is possible. e4. Knight a b4, pushing that queen away first. Queen e2, and f takes. Queen takes and rook d8. Black certainly has an edge here. That c pawn and those knights are very well placed. So it doesn't really matter that white is down the black is down the exchange. So the best continuation here would be rook a d1. Potentially there will be no bishop threats on that a1 rook, so now it's out of the way. It's defending the center. And if c2, then rook d2. But knight c3 comes, very annoying. And the knight can even go to a2, queen e1, knight c2 a2, queen to a1, let's say, keeping hold on everything, but then the queen activates via d6. Eventually, you'll just have to give up that rook. You have to give the exchange back. Rook takes, knight takes, and queen takes a2, but then knight takes d4. And after knight takes d4, you have bishop takes d4. Black has a little more activity. You are threatening, of course, to capture on g3, and you are up a pawn. However, the bishops are of opposite colors, and maybe if white is lucky and can exchange some major pieces, white could push for a draw. This would be the best defense possible. But after rook d8, rook f e1 was played. Then simply c5 was the response. c2 was also possible here, just going for it. And the point being, let's say knight g5, going for an attack, you have knight f6, queen to e2, and h6. And if once the knight moves back, let's say knight e4, you can grab on d4. Over here we can see that that knight on b4 is a rock solid piece. That pawn on c2 is well defended. There really isn't much hope for white to make progress here. This was possible, but c5 is also good enough. D takes c5, and c2 here is quite important, and in fact it's very, very strong. Something, let's say rook a to c1, just blocking. Knight c3 comes. Queen into b7, now queen into c5. Knight to g5, going for f7, rook f8. Knight e4 hitting the queen, queen h5. Knight into c3 and b into c3, and black is fine. Bishop b2 can come next once that e1 rook is saved. And yeah, black will certainly gain a lot of material here. But after d into c5, queen into c5 first was played. This is not as precise as going with c2 first. knight g5 going after h7 and h6 here. Now it seems that we have allowed queen into h7, but that's not a very good move. Queen into h7 just leads to king f8, and where do you go with the knight? You have nothing really better than knight into f7 and king into f7 and bishop h3. Knight f6 and bishop into e6, but black holds on here. If queen j6, queen h5, and black is perfectly fine in this position. There isn't too much white can really push for. That pawn on c3 is really a monster. If, let's say, after h6 knight f3, then we play c2. Now finally, of course, even Korobov would play it. Rook ac1 and knight c3. And we've seen this line before. Queen can take on b7, but knight comes on a2 and rook has to give up and give itself up for the pawn, and we'll capture back with the knight. If rook f1, then knight c3 comes back, and black is winning this one. So after h6, knight into f7 was played, thinking that we'll grab on e6. King takes f7, queen takes e6 check, and king f8. Queen f5 check and king g8. So for a moment it seems that white has gained some activity and some initiative, but the best course of action here could be bishop to e4. But then queen c7. We'll reroute the queen to f7 and queen h7, then king f8. That bishop on g7 is an excellent defensive piece. Rook ad1 here, let's say putting pressure, but queen f7. Black is holding on perfectly fine. Bishop takes and knight takes, rook to d3, but rook d7. And yeah, we can be rest assured that black is fine here. This would be this is the engine's favorite line. But after king g8, rook ad1 was played, again a very natural looking move. But rook f8 simply. The problem here is that we have time to play rook f8. And that's quite sensitive on f2, so queen e6 check is mandatory to avoid any attacks on f2. King h8 and now rook e2. Here, knight f6, no targets on d5, bishop to h3, c2, and rook c1. Now rook e8 was played here. Of course, it's a very natural move, but a slightly better way is to play it with rook to d8. We're threatening rook d1 check, so we're encouraging king g2, and now rook e8. And if the queen moves anywhere, let's say queen f5, you can throw in queen c6 check now, because the king is on g2, and then we can grab on e2. So the queen will be forced to capture on e8. Knight takes, rook takes, and king h7, and of course black is completely winning here. But rook e8 was played here, and this allowed queen f5. This is also fine. Queen takes f5, rook takes e8, knight takes e8, and bishop takes f5. Bishop b2 here, rook takes c2, and knight takes c2, and bishop takes c2. White has two pawns for a piece, but the question is, will white be able to hold on to those pawns? King g7 will activate the king in the endgame, and king g2. Bishop d4, and g4. Knight f6 here, g5, h takes, and knight to g4 here. That g pawn probably will not go too far. King f3, knight f2, one of the pawns has been recovered. King to f4 and b6. King to g3 and king to f7. King to f4 and king to e6. King to f3 and king e5. g6 and king f6. We stop that pawn. King g3, bishop to c5. No hurry. The knight is safe, that bishop is untouchable. King f3, knight h3, king g4 and knight to g5. And it seems for a moment that we can throw in g7. And once the king will capture, we can capture that knight on g5. And it's a draw. However, can you spot the move? It's knight f7. And the point is, of course, if you queen, you will simply die to a fork. So Niemann promoted to a knight, but king g7, and we see that the knight is trapped. They played on for a few more moves. King to f5, king takes g8 and king e6, knight g5 check, king to d5, king f7, king c6, and knight f3, king to d5 and king e7. And it was here that white resigned, because there really is nothing more to be done. That extra piece is a decisive advantage and a very nice victory for Anton Korobov. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.